Say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud. Say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud. Sorry, I felt like saying it twice today. The second time is for Mr. John Lewis, okay? Super proud of that young man, or actually he is gone on to glory. But when I tell you I have a little mini slideshow for John Lewis, that man got heart. Now, John Lewis was one of the original freedom riders, and today we are talking about the freedom rides of 1961. The Freedom Ride campaign of 1961 took place from May 4th to December 16th. And in spring of 1961, student activists from the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, launched the Freedom Rides to challenge segregation on interstate buses and bus terminals and any of its entities. So the bathrooms, the restaurants, the little shops. Traveling on buses from Washington, D.C. to Jackson, Mississippi was the goal. The riders met violent opposition in the Deep South, resulting in extensive media attention, which we'll get more into that violence and attention that they received, and it forced federal intervention from John F. Kennedy. The campaign succeeded in securing an Interstate Commerce Commission ban by November of 1961 on segregation in all facilities under its jurisdiction, as well as Martin Luther King. He did solicit and garner support from Robert Kennedy, the AG, and ensured that the Freedom Riders later on, when they get to the Deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, he ensured that they were well protected and taken care of. And we'll get more into that, as well as an incident that happened in Montgomery. So the Freedom Riders were first conceived in 1947 when CORE and the Fellowship of Reconciliation organized an interracial bus ride across state lines to test a Supreme Court decision that declared segregation on interstate buses unconstitutional. It was called the Journey of Reconciliation. The ride challenged bus segregation in its upper parts of the South. So, none of those deep South states like Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, where things get a lot more messier. 14 years later, there's sit-ins, boycotts. There's the SCLC that came after the Montgomery bus boycott that was formed by MLK, or led by MLK, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinated Committee, SNCC. So the Freedom Rides were able to leverage national attention from, the boycotts and things like that, the sit-ins, because again, here they go, challenging the status quo of racial injustices. Now, following an early ruling, which I talked about yesterday, Morgan versus Virginia in 1946, 1946, that made segregation in interstate transportation illegal. In 1960, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled Boynton versus Virginia that segregation in its facilities provided for the interstate travelers, such as bus terminals, restaurants, and restrooms, were also unconstitutional. Before the 1960s decision, two students, John Lewis and Bernard Lafayette, those are the two gentlemen here on the left. I have the screen, flipped or whatever, but the one with the glasses, that's Lafayette, and the one on the left side where there's just a shoulder on the side of him, that's John Lewis, who was the late congressman. And shout out to John Lewis, because John Lewis had heart, baby. Poor guy was beat up many a times, and he would not stop. And he rode all the way. He rode the ride all the way through. He actually started, though, by integrating buses in Nashville, Tennessee, him and Bernard Lafayette. And they did this by refusing to move and sitting at the front of the bus. Now, at first, CORE saw this and they were like, yeah, we're going to start recruiting volunteers to participate in a freedom ride. And so they invited John Lewis and Mr. Lafayette. Now, Mr. Lafayette's parents was like, nah, fam, that ain't what we doing. You're not going to do this. That's suicidal. We ain't having it. But John Lewis and 12 other activists formed the interracial group that underwent extensive training in nonviolence before launching the ride. On May 4th, 1961, the Freedom Riders left Washington, D.C. in two buses and headed towards New Orleans. Although they faced resistance and arrest in Virginia, it was not until the riders arrived in Rockville, South Carolina, that they encountered violence. I thought I had a photo, but I don't. So we're going to keep going. The beating of John Lewis and another rider, coupled with the arrest of a participant using an all-white bathroom, attracted widespread media coverage. And the following those incidents, the riders met with King and other civil rights leaders in Atlanta for a dinner. I'll highlight Mr. Lewis right here, even though I'll come back to this, because the one in the upper right corner where it has John Lewis and James Zweger, maybe saying that wrong, that actually took place in Montgomery. But the other two are pictures of Mr. John Lewis being arrested. So in Rockville, South Carolina, they encountered violence, but they made it all the way to Atlanta, and they're at this dinner held by Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders. And Martin Luther King leans over and tells a jet reporter named Simon Booker, and this is according to John Lewis, that they're not going to make it through Alabama. Well, MLK was right. He knew Montgomery from the boycotts. And this is a picture of the bus, or one of them, in Anniston, Alabama on May 14th. Here's another viewpoint of the bombing of the bus in Anniston, Alabama, which is right outside of Birmingham, where riders were met by a violent mob, over 100 people. Before the bus arrival in Birmingham, Anniston local authorities had given permission of the Klan to strike against the Freedom Riders without fear of arrest. Now, when the bus driver pulled up, the driver yelled outside, "Well, boys, here they are." This is the bus driver talking to the Klan. "I bought you some NERs and some NER lovers," literally in quotes. And one of the buses were firebombed, and in its fleeing, passengers were forced into the angry mob to flee, the fire. Now, the violence continued when they made it to the Birmingham terminal, where Eugene Bull Connor's police forced the riders off with no protection, and thus they were beaten. I actually had a photo of someone getting stomped, and I'm like, nah, baby, I don't want to see that, and I hope nobody else wants to see that. It's a whole bunch of white men stomping. I don't know if it's another white person or a black person, but I don't want to see it. So the violence garnered national news. And James Farmer, one of the core activists, he ended the campaign and flew the riders to New Orleans. And I'm sorry, this is kind of premature. This is Montgomery, so let me go back a step. Here they are in New Orleans, or a couple of them, after that's Mr. Ziegler, who was beaten, poor dude. And then in the upper right corner, that was Mr. Ziegler, like just freshly getting beaten and teeth knocked out of his mouth. And John Lewis has his own blood on the right side of his body. So the Freedom Riders were sent to New Orleans, and they stayed there for 3 days. Diane Nash, who I did a video on at the beginning of the month, or at least a photo, she stated that we cannot let the violence stop us. If we do, the movement is dead. And so 3 days later, even though some other core activists was against it, the Freedom Riders started again. And MLK declined to join the rise when Diane Nash and Rodney Powell invited him to do so. On May 17th, 7 men and 3 women rode to Nashville to Birmingham to resume the Freedom Rise. Just before reaching Birmingham, the bus was pulled over and directed to the Birmingham station, where all the riders were arrested for defying segregation laws. I'm gonna wrap this up here because I realize we're gonna need a part 2. I'm 9 minutes in, and we haven't even got to the stuff that went down in Montgomery and in Jackson. So see you in part 2 of the Freedom Rise of 1961.